national holidays. They're not religious holidays, and yet they have great meaning to us. And today, of course, is the day that Congress established many years ago, actually in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, as Mother's Day, to celebrate those who are mothers. I was kind of thinking as I was sitting, waiting to stand up and speak this morning, that some years ago, when Josh Spence was married in Knoxville, that after the ceremony, somebody came up to us, me, and said, "Boy, I've never quite heard a ceremony like that." Said, "I don't know if I'd got married, but I heard that before I got married," because I talked about responsibility. It seems like that most of the time when we're talking on Mother's Day, some people that have a different personality than I guess, have a very bubbly attitude toward that and talk about all things that are very near and dear to them, and in praise. And it's kind of interesting. I picked a chapter this morning to look at, in part, that's a little interesting. It's a little different. You know, sometimes when you talk about responsibility, people don't like the idea of responsibility. And that's what this passage actually is addressing. And the second thing is that the passage we're going to look at this morning is kind of an unusual passage. It is in a chapter that is probably one of the best known chapters in the Old Testament. And it is in the 31st chapter of Proverbs. And that 31st chapter, normally we begin reading at verse 10. And I have read these verses many times, and quite often we find that we read it at a funeral service, where we talk about a person's character. But it's interesting that in this same chapter you have one of the most recognizable pieces of Scripture that there is in talking about the virtuous woman, for her price is above rubies. And then at the same time, you have the first 9 verses that are almost obscure. It would seem to me that probably, unless I'm wrong, probably you may have never heard a lesson based on the first 9 verses of Proverbs 31. I don't believe that I have. I don't believe that I ever had a sermon that's based specifically on these 9 verses. Now, when you look at these 9 verses, I kind of wonder why we haven't addressed them, why we don't talk about them. Because when we come to Mother's Day and you're praising mothers, what are you praising them for? You're praising them basically because they recognized the responsibility they had and they discharged that responsibility. That's what you're praising them for in almost every case. And this first chapter is a chapter that deals with one mother's discharging of her responsibility. Now, one of the problems that you have in a passage like this is you don't know all the whys and the wherefores. It begins in this way, the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. We don't have the exact identity of the person, though almost every scholar that you read actually believes that Solomon is simply not mentioning his own name, but he is actually talking about his mother and the things that she taught him. Now, when I began to think about that, I began to realize some things. You know, she speaks of the special relationship she had with her son. Now, if Solomon is the person being spoken of, and if his mother was addressing the situation, his mother would have been Bathsheba. And there are a lot of things to think about that. One is, if Solomon is the person there. David, his father, was one of the most prominent characters of the Old Testament. And yet when he talks about the things that were taught him, they were taught by his mother. That's not unusual, by the way. If you ask almost any person about the earliest lessons in their life and where they came from, they're generally not going to be their father. It's usually going to be their mother. That's generally the case. And there's a reason for that. Whatever we do in modern society to try to equalize the relationship of mothers and fathers, I still see the same thing. And what I still see is when children are very young, that their mothers are the prominent person in their life. In almost every case that I see, whether you're talking about the most liberated of women or whether you're talking about the most traditional of women, that's still kind of what you see, no matter what you look at. And it's kind of interesting to read what is said in this particular situation. It was his mother that taught him, and that's what he says, whether it was Solomon or some other. But what she said in verse 2, and is speaking of her words, is really interesting. You know, when you go back and you think about this idea of how important mothers are in the upbringing of children, particularly in the early part of their life, you kind of reminded of Paul's statement concerning Timothy. You know, Timothy's father's not mentioned at all. In fact, the only time he's ever mentioned is that it says that his mother was a Jew and he was a Greek, and that's the only mention that we have of his father. In this chapter, Paul talks about, I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus when I went to Macedonia, that thou mightest charge to some that they teach no other doctrine. Paul talking to Timothy. Neither give heed to fables and endless genealogy, which minister questions, rather than godly edifying, which is in faith, so do. Now the end of the commandment is charity. I think I'm reading the wrong passage. I'm sorry. I wrote first and it should have been second. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, I'm a little off there. I thank God, whom I serve from my forefathers with pure conscience, that without ceasing I have remembrance of thee in my prayers night and day, greatly desiring to see thee, mindful of thy tears, that I may be filled with joy. He's praising Timothy for the man that he is. And then he says, when I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois and thy mother Eunice, and I am persuaded that in thee also. Wherefore I put thee in remembrance that thou stir up the gift of God which is in thee with the putting on of my hands. Talking about the apostle laying his hands upon him. But the thing he mentions as producing a foundation upon which all was built was his mother and his grandmother. Those are the two persons mentioned. And I think that's very significant. And it really looks very similar to what you read in this passage when this woman said in verse 2, what, my son? These are questions. And what, the son of my womb? And what, the son of my vows? You know, no matter what happens in life, your mother holds a relationship to you that no one else could ever. Simply because you live with your mother 9 months before you live with anyone else. The son of my womb, she said. The son of my vows. It's kind of interesting that when you look over to Luke chapter 2 and you think about Jesus and when he's lost in the city of Jerusalem, that the spokesperson in this situation was not his father. Now his father and mother found him and they saw him, they were amazed, and his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrow. And he said unto them, How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my father's business? And they understood not the saying that he spake unto them. And when he came down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them, but his mother kept all these sayings in her heart. In most cases, maybe not everyone, but in most cases, whenever a person says they're going back to the home place, they're going, well, we're going to go over to Mama's. Most of the time they don't say they're going over to Daddy's. You ever notice it? They might occasionally, but that's not generally true. They might even say Mama and Daddy, but if they mention one, it'll usually be over to Mama's. And I've never seen any men that get upset over that and throw a fit and say, why can't you talk about me sometimes? They kind of understand, hey, that child has a bond and has a relationship that is very, very special. And you can see that when you look at the relationship that Jesus had with his mother. I include one other passage, and didn't include one that I thought of that I'll mention. But in John chapter 2, when you come to the first miracle that Jesus performed, I think it's kind of significant in those first 5 verses who was there and who was responsible for it and who had the confidence in her son. And the third day, there was a marriage in Caney of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus said unto him, they have no wine. Jesus said unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. His mother saith unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. It's an interesting read to think about the fact that the Son of God, eternal being, had a special relationship with the woman that bore him in the flesh. And it's an interesting thought. I didn't include the passage, but at the end of the book of John, you find when Jesus was crucified, what he thought of all the 7 sayings on the cross. And one of them was to John and to his mother, taking care of his mother even as he was departing this world, and saying to John, Behold thy mother, and to his mother, Behold thy son. It's interesting to think of how special that relationship is. Here in the 31st chapter, you read so often beginning in verse 10, you don't read the first 9 verses, and in doing that, you miss a great deal. Now let's think about this. When you look down into this passage and this advice that this woman is giving to her son, she seemed to recognize that the 2 strongest temptations young men must deal with, and it's still pretty much the case. I mean, if you look at problems that where young men get in trouble, almost always it has to do with a woman, or it has to do with some type of mind-altering drug. It might be alcohol, it might be something else in today's world, and they deal mostly with alcohol here. But it's interesting what she said to him. Give not thy strength unto women, nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings. Now, that's a very interesting thought if you think about it. Now, Solomon already written about both of these. We're going to look at that in a moment when we look at these 2 verses. But before we go any further, let's think about this. When you look at why the nation of Israel was ultimately brought to its knees and destroyed, it really began with Ahab. And if you read about Ahab, who died and all of his sons died so that they couldn't be kings after him, the reason was, in this case, Jezebel. It was. I mean, God said that he did evil, which his wife Jezebel stirred up. And God said he was the worst king in all of the history of the Jewish nation. So this woman gives him advice, and she said, and you know, in a sense, what she's saying is this. Whether you're a man or a woman, but if you're a young person, you're choosing a wife, you need to realize something, and she seems to be saying it, though she doesn't say it in so many words, that the decision that you make as to who you marry will dictate to a great extent the kind of life you have and the kind of life you live. And that's what she seems to be saying to him. And she's emphasizing that to him. Now, the second thing in this passage is that she goes on to say, it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink. I saw a documentary not too long ago, been a few years, but not too long ago, about Richard Nixon. And not talking about Watergate. This wasn't about Watergate. This was about him as a person and as a president, something I didn't know. Do you know when Nixon was president that according to the documentary, by pretty near 9 o'clock almost every night, he was pretty much incapacitated because he's an alcoholic and had a serious drinking problem. And so the Vice President of the United States was kind of put on notice, if we have a problem, then you're going to have to deal with it because this man's not going to be able to. And when you understand that, you kind of realize why this woman would say what she did. It's not for kings to drink wine nor for princes strong drink. Of all things you don't want is you don't want a drunk president in charge of the nuclear football or the military might of the United States. That's really something that those people recognized in his time and something that she's stating. Of course, you could expand that to realize this, that if it's going to destroy a king's effectiveness, it's probably going to destroy anybody's effectiveness. But it goes on to say in this situation, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Give strong drink to him that is ready to perish, and wine to those that be of a heavy heart. Let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his misery no more. Kind of interesting to think about that situation. If you go over to the book of Proverbs chapter 23, this woman that was a very wise woman, no doubt, the kind of mother that every person should desire to have, that sought their best interest. She must have impressed that pretty well upon him when he was a young man, if it was Solomon that was being discussed. Because in the 26th chapter of the 26th verse of the 26th chapter, 23rd chapter of the 26th verse, Solomon wrote this: My son, give me thine heart, and let thine eyes observe my ways. For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. She also lieth in wait as a prey, and increases the transgressors among men. And then he changes to the other problem that is a large problem. Who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath babbling? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek the mixed wine. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth its color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. At the last it biteth like a serpent, stingeth like an adder. This woman was wise enough to tell her son that. Thine eyes shall behold strange women, thine heart shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the midst of a sea, and he that lieth upon the top of a mast. They have stricken me, shalt thou say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I wake? I will seek it yet again. You know, sometimes we need to kind of realize something. Things don't change much. Everything's pretty much the same as it always was. If you look around you today, the biggest temptations that your children face, whether you're talking about school or wherever, really is sexual misconduct and drugs, either alcohol or some other form. This woman, as a wise mother, was warning her son about those things. Now, all that's important because something that sometimes we don't remember is that godly mothers have a grave responsibility. Now let's stop and let's think about this. She spoke of making sure that we're always aware of what's important and are prepared to be a part of the solution, not the problem. That's what she's talking about here. She's saying what will make it where that you are going to be useful to others around you. As a king. King has more responsibility than anyone in the kingdom. So when he talked about not drinking, give strong drink to those that are ready to perish, and wine to those that be of heavy heart. Let him drink and forget his poverty, remember his misery no more. Seems to be talking of something that would relate to what we're talking about today, of sedating someone or something in that case. Open thy mouth with the dumb and the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction, talking as his responsibility as the king. Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and the needy. It's then that you jump into the virtuous woman. But the interesting thing is that this woman, as a mother, was trying to make sure that her child was going to be a contributor to society rather than a detractor from society. that he was going to be one of the ones that caused the society to stand strong and not going to be one of those that had to be constantly helped along by others around you. As mothers, about the greatest gift you can give your children is the ability to live their lives independently and not be dependent upon everyone else and be able to contribute to the welfare of those around them. You know, you can't be among those who feel sorry for yourself. You just can't. And that seems to be what she's saying to a certain degree. I have a feeling that almost everybody sometimes kind of feels like, woe is me, and I have a hard time. And one of the things that I observe with Pat as a mother is with all three children, when something comes up and they feel like everything's just gone to pot and I don't know how I'm going to handle it. I'm not too great at giving such advice, but she is. And one of the things that we do is what this mother's doing. She's saying to him, okay, you're the king. You have a pretty tough job. You're going to have to kind of keep yourself so that you're able to discharge that job. And you make sure that you are able to do that. And that you're not sitting around saying, oh, woe is me. I just, you can almost see it. Some people say, I'm a king. I've got so much to do. I just can't enjoy life. Well, you know what? You have some responsibility here, and you need to discharge it. Let's go back a little bit and read some passages in the New Testament. I want to read about Jesus and think about him. He was a king. He was born to be a king, we're told, by himself. And when you read about him, and you look here in Matthew chapter 20, you've got these people who are James and John, and they come to him with their mother, and they want a certain thing of him. Now, they are viewing kingship as privilege, obviously. And when he said unto her, what wilt thou? She said unto him, grant that these my two sons may sit, one on the right hand, one on the left in thy kingdom. But Jesus answered and said, you know not what you ask, but are you able to drink of the cup that I shall drink of? Talking about his crucifixion, and to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. They say unto him, we're able. Never answer a question you don't understand. But they did answer it, and they had no idea what he was talking about. He said unto them, you shall indeed drink of my cup, be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with, but to sit on my right hand, on my left, is not mine to give. But it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared of my Father. And when the 10 heard it, they were moved with indignation against their two brethren. Then Jesus called them, and he spoke to all of them, and corrected the situation. He said this, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority over them. And it shall not be so among you. But whosoever be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to minister and give his life a ransom for many. Now you think about what he's saying and think about what's being said by this woman back in Ecclesiastes chapter 31. In saying to her children, and to her son in this case, the king, and saying to him, now I know you're the king, but here's what I want to happen. I want in life for you to be someone that's useful. The greatest gift you can give your children is to cause them to be able to be, as Jesus said, servant. That's what he said. Teach them that they're contributors. They're not to expect things from others. They're to be in the case of being the ones who give things to others. And if you look at mothers, good mothers, you see, what do you see? I'm kind of reminded a little bit of during the COVID deal. And Lindsay got COVID, and she called up and said, well, I've got COVID, but you know what? I got 3 kids. I haven't got time to be sick. And that's kind of the way it is with most mothers. They just go through. They drive themselves. And in so doing, they set an example before. I mean, my wife is one that's just, as a mother, her children, if you've ever been around them, you understand right quick. That's the most important thing in life. And to just train them and teach them. And that's what this woman is attempting to do. You know, in the book of Galatians, Galatians is an interesting book, chapter 6, because it talks about things that almost seem contradictory. And a wise woman, as a mother who's teaching her children, has kind of a hard time teaching the lesson and showing them how special they are, but at the same time, how responsible they must be. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, you were spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. If a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. Mothers, teach that lesson to their children. You're not the center of the universe. Let every man prove his own work, and then shall we have rejoicing in himself and not in another. You're kind of a personal human being. And while others may help you, when it comes down to it, every man shall bear his own burden. And then it goes on to say, let him is taught the word, communicate to him that teaches and all these good things. Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth his flesh shall the flesh reap corruption. He that soweth the spirit shall the spirit reap life everlasting. Let us not be weary in well-doing. For in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As we have, therefore, opportunity, let us do good to all men, especially them who are in the household of faith. Interesting line. When you think of the lesson that mothers are teaching children, what is the most common lesson you see you're trying to teach? Sharing. That's the most common lesson. And what is that? That's what he's talking about here. You don't look at yourself as the center of the universe. You look at yourself as someone who contributes to the welfare of other people. Now, when you think about mothers have to remember some things. And it's the problem that I sometimes see in today's world. You know, children are not only great blessings, they're also great responsibilities. I mean, they are. If you ever look at a mother's life, you understand pretty quickly that it's like in modern society, most families have both persons in the workforce. The mother's usually the one that is just added to her responsibilities. And that's what happens. And there's no way to escape that. And if we view children simply as blessings and we don't look at them as great responsibilities, then we're not going to do too well. You look at this woman, what's she doing? She's looking at her son and saying, hey, you need to be a contributor. You need to be doing things that are useful to society, even though you're a king. Mothers are the first teachers because after all, generally speaking, the mother will be the first person they ever see. And it'll be the person that they're around more than anybody else during the formative years of their life, without question. Mothers are going to be teachers, and they're going to be examples. And if you look at what this woman is doing in the 31st chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes, she's simply reiterating that. I recognize that I'm going to play a great part in what takes place here. We have in our country what's called a Head Start program for underprivileged children. But you know what? Mothers were the original Head Start program. They are really the ones that give their children a head start. And I think we need to appreciate them for it, and that mothers simply need to recognize that. Blessed are those who have mothers that understand that. People have to realize that God set in order a plan. Mothers are an extremely important part of that plan. And they have to accept that role. And when you look at the 31st chapter of Ecclesiastes, while it's a pretty obscure passage, you may have never read it, you may have never heard a sermon relating to it before. But it's talking about a mother who understood. And certainly a great lesson can be learned from it, the kinds of things that we should teach our children and what's extremely important. And we need to be appreciative as adults of mothers who've done that in our lives. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. We've not had a first principle sermon, but if you do need, in fact, to be obedient to the gospel, there's one thing that this song, number 268, emphasizes, and that is the free will nature of the church of the Lord. I am a citizen of the United States because I was born in Alabama. And that made me a citizen. I may have been a productive citizen in my lifetime. That's for history to judge. I could have been a scourge on society. But I was put somewhere. That wasn't my choosing. It's just the way it happened. As Solomon said, time and chance happen to us all. But every person who's a member of the body of Christ, every person who's a member of the kingdom of God is there because there is an invitation that's extended from the Lord that says, come be a part of it. That's what this is talking about. Hark the gentle voice of Jesus calling. That's what he's saying. Saying we need to pay attention to it. When you look at the New Testament and you look at the occasions where people are being taught, and every case where there's extended reference to the conversation, there's always some type of a statement that says the ball is in your hands. Decision is yours. And that's what this is talking about. Whether it's the day of Pentecost, where it said, men and brethren, what should we do? And they said, repent and be baptized. Or whether it's the Philippian jailer who was told to believe, and he's baptized the same hour of the night. Whatever it is, there's always that responsibility that's placed on the individual to make that choice, to make that decision. We encourage you to do so. Together we stand as we sing.